Good morning, Old Testament survey students. This is Mr. Albers, and I'm going to be briefly talking about the kingdom dividing, the kingdom here being the kingdom of Israel, which you should have already read about in 1 Kings 12, and as well as seen in the video that y'all watched just a few minutes ago. But this is going to pick up in your guided notes with number 2 in the section, the kingdom divides, in 931 BC. So hopefully you're following along there, and let's jump in. All right, so we can title this section Rehoboam's Folly. Well, who is Rehoboam? Well, Rehoboam is the son and heir of King Solomon. Okay, so Solomon dies, Rehoboam becomes king, they've got a coronation, and then his people come to him with a request. So to kind of try to imagine this, put it in our setting. Imagine you came to, think of a class where, it's a class where you learn a lot, but you feel maybe overwhelmed by the workload. And so you get a new teacher, or it's a new year, you have a new teacher in the same subject, and you come to the teacher and say, hey, we really, liked previous teacher, but the load was so heavy. We had all this homework, and we had all these quizzes, he made us memorize the original Hebrew, da-da-da-da-da. Please, could you, we want you to succeed, but could you please lighten our load a little bit? Okay, so that's essentially what the people come to Rehoboam and say. Solomon had presided over a golden age, but there were some darker sides to that as well. We might remember the forced labor that he instituted to help with building the temple, right? Israelites that didn't get to choose, right, but were taken from their homes and sent up into Lebanon to help chop down trees, float them down the river, or to go to Jerusalem to actually do the construction of the temple. And Solomon would rotate through them, but forced labor, the taxes that people had to pay, those were not things that went over super well. And towards the end of his reign, Solomon started becoming less of a wise and moral and upright figure. You might recall that. So anyway, the people come to Rehoboam. They say, please lighten our load. And so Rehoboam's first response is actually quite good. He says, hey, let me think about it. Okay, can you come back in 3 days? Let me consider. And so they go, and he goes, and he looks for advice. Okay, so he seeks advice first from the people that were his father's advisors, who are older, wiser, have been around the block, more mature. So very good move. That's the thing to do. And they say, look, Rehoboam, if you agree with the people, if you do this for them, they will love you forever. Like, they'll always remember it. This is your chance to make a great impression. Like, you can absolutely say yes to this. Okay? But then Rehoboam goes and he talks to his the young men who had grown up with him, so maybe like his college buddies, we might say. And he says, okay, what do you guys think? And they say, look, man, you got to show them that you mean business, right? Like, they're trying, like, if you give them an inch, they're going to take a mile. So you need to tell them, not only are you not going to lighten it, but you're going to make it heavier. Like, you need to go tell them that you haven't seen anything yet. You thought my father was bad. Like, my little finger is thicker than his leg, right? Like, you felt like you were being whipped, I'm going to make you feel like you're being whipped with scorpions. And so somehow Rehoboam gets into his head that this is the advice that he should accept. Okay, and so he goes back, people come back, they're led by Jeroboam. You might remember him. He's the one that had the encounter with the prophet Ahijah, who tore his robe and gave Jeroboam 10 pieces, signifying that he would be king. And they come back, and Rehoboam says, I will add to your yoke. You felt like you're being beaten with whips. I'm going to make you feel like you're being whipped with scorpions. And naturally, as you can expect, imagine what your reaction would be if your new teacher gives you something like that. Hey, you thought that was bad. I'm going to double the quizzes. We're going to have more work. We're going to have reading all the time. There's a revolt. The northern tribes over Jeroboam say, forget this. We're going to go do our own thing. We are done with David's house. So before we get to Rehoboam's response to this revolt, let's just talk through the fallout. of this decision because there's a lot going on all in this one moment. This is a very important moment in Old Testament history. Okay. First of all, the author of Kings adds in verse 15 of this chapter that Rehoboam's failure to listen to the people is at least partially caused by the Lord's determination to fulfill his promise to Jeroboam. So we recall the Lord, through the prophet Ahijah, mentioned earlier, had promised Jeroboam that he would be king over 10 tribes. This is the moment when that's going to come to pass. Now, why did Jeroboam get that promise? Well, that takes us back even further into Solomon's reign, and we'll talk about that in a few more slides. Hopefully you remember a little bit, or some little dots are connecting in your mind. Could raise all sorts of questions like, well, wait a minute, like, is God causing Rehoboam to sin? No. Scripture is very clear that God does not cause anyone to do evil, right? God is not the origin of evil. There's no shadow, there's no variation, there's no imperfection or impurity with God. But Scripture is equally clear, and this is one of those places, that when humans or anyone is sinning, right, which applies to the devil and his minions too, we don't magically go outside of God's control just because we are rebelling against him, right? God is still king. Our rebellion does not negate God's ability and his wisdom to providentially guide human affairs and human history. Scripture is very clear on that. We see countless examples of that, and this is one of those places. We see this a lot in Kings, in the history of Israel, that the narrator gives us little glimpses into the fact that humans are doing things or making choices. Rehoboam is sinning in this case. His choices have consequences, but behind the scenes and through it all, God is the one who is ultimately at work to orchestrate his own good and wise purposes. So that's very clear here, and that helps us to answer number 3, right? In an ultimate way, God is behind these affairs. God is not out of control when people sin. Okay? Now, what is the immediate result of this revolt? Well, Israel, or the Israelites, maybe we should say, from henceforth, are going to be split into 2 kingdoms. Okay? And there's a couple different names for these kingdoms. The north is the bigger one. Sometimes we call it the north or the northern kingdom. Scripture uses the word Israel to refer to this, okay? So starting with this moment, most of the time when the Old Testament says Israel, it's referring to the 10 northern tribes. Not always. Sometimes just because it's not like they became a separate people. Sometimes Israel is used to look forward to a time when all God's people would be united again. But from henceforth, the kingdom of Israel, quote unquote, is going to refer to the 10 northern tribes, whose first king is Jeroboam. We'll talk more about him and their kings tomorrow. And the southern kingdom, 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. But Judah was by far the biggest of these. Benjamin's actually the smallest of the tribes. And so because of the dominance of Judah, and because the kings, the Davidic line is from the tribe of Judah, were in the south is just basically known as Judah throughout its existence. Okay, so we've got Israel in the north, Judah in the south. All right, and that's the answer to number 4. We got a split kingdom. Israel's the north, Judah's the south. Okay, so the north is breaking away. Rehoboam is not just going to take this lying down, at least not at first. So what does he start off by doing? Well, first thing he does is he decides, hey, I'm going to send the head over all the forced labor, the taskmaster, to go bring him back. Because again, he thinks that's a great idea. Well, naturally, the people are not pleased to see the head taskmaster. Remember, they had been complaining about how much work Solomon had imposed on them. So they stone the taskmaster to death, and then they turn on Rehoboam, and he has to get into his chariot, and he's got to hit the road and fly back to Jerusalem so that he doesn't get captured or worse by this angry group of people. So he gets to Jerusalem, and the first thing he does there is he decides, you know what, I'm going to march an army into the north, and I'm going to take those 10 tribes back by force. So he musters an army of 180,000 men, and he is going to march north into Israel. But as he's doing this, right, as he's on the brink of basically initiating a civil war among God's people, God speaks to a prophet Shemaiah. And Shemaiah takes the message to Rehoboam, and he says, Rehoboam, stop. Do not go against your relatives. Do not invade the north. This thing is from the Lord. Okay, clear implication. If you do this, God is going to be against you, and it is not going to succeed. And Rehoboam, for the first time, since he initially decided to ask advice from his father's advisors, for the first time since that little moment, he shows a spark of wisdom, and he listens, and he obeys, and he sends the army home, and he does not initiate a civil war, and he allows the 10 northern tribes to break off and to be their own nation. Okay, so this provides, I think, a little spark of hope, right? And this is number 5. He listens to the word of the Lord, and in the south, there are going to be some kings who do that. The south is not going to have, the great history that maybe we would expect for the people of God or that the prophets envisioned, but it's going to be closer than the north. There's going to be at least a little seed of a remnant of people, and even some kings of the south are going to genuinely seek to honor God. That's where the Davidic line remains. That's where Jerusalem is. That's where the temple is. That's where most of the Levites, actually, who didn't have a specific allotment of territory, most of the Levites would end up coming to Jerusalem as well to serve in and around the temple. And so the south is going to be a little bit more obedient throughout its history than the north is. Okay, and I think that's the little foreshadowing mentioned there in number 5. And yes, we might say it provides a glimmer of hope. Okay, so show some maps just so we have an idea of what's going on here. So this map is the 12 tribes right after the conquest here. So we'll notice there's a couple of very interesting things that make it tricky to count. We'll notice that there's a West Manasseh and an East Manasseh. Remember, the tribe of Joseph was so big that it was basically 2 different tribes named after his son Manasseh and his son Ephraim. And Ephraim ended up actually, despite all of that land that Manasseh has, Ephraim became the one that was dominant, more populous actually. And so, in fact, sometimes you'll even see the north. We've already said that's referred to as Israel. Just like the south is referred to as Judah in shorthand, sometimes the north in this part of the Bible is referred to as Ephraim because Ephraim was the dominant tribe there. Okay, and then we can see that Benjamin is down here and Judah is down here. The tribe of Simeon it's interesting. Its land was completely enclosed by Judah, and it seems like at this time that it was almost subsumed into Judah, so to speak. Maybe raises some questions as like, well, wait a minute, I thought it was 10 northern tribes and 2 southern tribes. How does that, well, does Joseph count as 1 tribe or 2 tribes? What about the Levites? How do we, and, the text is not trying to sit down and say, okay, there were exactly this many Simeonites here and this many Levites here and this, that, and the other. It's giving us a general basic, this is what happened, right? We would refer to the north just simply as 10 tribes and the south simply as 2 tribes, even though the picture is a little more complicated than that. Because the point of the text is not to adjudicate, okay, how does Joseph count as 1 or 2, and the Levites, how do they count? So if that bothers you as you're reading the text, my encouragement would be to not spend too much time, and heartburn being concerned about that. The text is not trying to unwrap all of those specific numbers. It's just trying to tell us basically and in general what happened. Okay, so another map here. This on the left is the kingdom of Saul, is this purple. The green was added by David. Most of that was military expansion. And then Solomon controlled, or basically dominated, even up to here, up to the river Euphrates there, which is here. So this is the land that was controlled by Solomon, okay? The United Kingdom, we might say. And then he was friends with Phoenicia here, Tyre and Sidon. That's where the wood to build the temple came from, modern-day Lebanon. Okay, now look over to the right. I know the scale is not exactly the same. If you want to try to orient yourself, maybe look at the Dead Sea size here and the Dead Sea size here. So this one, the one on the right, is a little bit bigger. But here's Judah, here's the southern kingdom, right? And here's Israel, the northern kingdom. And then notice that a lot of this other territory that David had controlled, that Solomon had controlled, during this time kind of gains its own autonomy again. So the Philistines kind of retake control of their land, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Arameans or the Syrians, and then we have Phoenicia up here as well. But this territory on the right, not only is it split, I shouldn't forget to mention the Edomites down here either, not only is it split, but the entirety, if you were to put the north and south together, is still significantly smaller. In fact, the northern border of Israel would be more like over here, and a far cry from what Solomon controlled. Okay, and let's wrap up by talking about why this happened. And this is question number 6, okay? And to do this, we're going to flash back several weeks and a couple chapters to 1 Kings 11. We remember that Solomon, despite his great wisdom, towards the end of his life, he started to become prideful and he started to marry many foreign women. The idea is not he shouldn't be marrying people that are not Israelites. It's he shouldn't be marrying people that don't worship the Lord. He also multiplied horses and multiplied wealth exceedingly. So if you go back to Deuteronomy 17 and look at the things that the king was not supposed to do, was marry a bunch of pagans, multiply horses, especially from Egypt, and accumulate a whole lot of wealth for himself. Solomon does all 3 of those things towards the end of his reign. And predictably, as he marries all these people who do not worship the Lord, he starts to be turned after their gods, and he starts to worship their gods as well. And so the Lord is angry with Solomon because of what's happened, because his heart had turned away. He did not do what the Lord had commanded. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this has been your practice, you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I've commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant." Well, we've seen that, right? Jeroboam was originally one of Solomon's officials. He was a servant of Solomon, and he is now the king of 10 of the tribes of Israel. But he's only king of 10 of the tribes. Why? Well, let's keep reading. "Yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days." How's that for a humbling word, right? Solomon, what you've done you deserve to lose the kingdom. But you know what? I'm not going to bring this consequence in your lifetime. I'm going to hold off and be patient and be merciful because of your father, because of David. But I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Now, we may be tempted to say, well, that doesn't seem fair. Like Rehoboam got a pretty raw deal, didn't he? Well, in a sense, if this is all we're looking at, it may seem like that. Couple things to keep in mind, and we could say much more on this. One, Rehoboam's folly contributed to this, right? It's not like Rehoboam was a shining example of wisdom who was making decisions that should have been acceptable to the 10 northern tribes, right? He was a fool, and he paid for his folly, right? He is responsible as well. It's a complicated thing. 2, sin has splash effects, right? We may not like this, but the sins of one generation affect the sins of the next generation and on, right? We see this in patterns of sin, maybe. Maybe you have some of those that you've seen in your own family or in your relatives, right? When I, as a father, commit sin, it affects my children. Now, I may not like that. I may wish that my sin only had consequences for me, but that's not the way the world works, right? The world's never worked that way. Why do we have sin in the first place? Because of the sinful decision of our forefather Adam, right? And that allowed sin into the world and infected us all with the same guilt and the same sinful, twisted hearts that we all participate in that, right? Now, the glorious news of the gospel is that though it only took one man to mess all that up, it only took one man to fix it all and to fix it better, and that is the second Adam, Jesus Christ. But the sins of one generation do carry on and affect the next generation. That's the way the world works, whether we really like it that way or not. Okay, let's keep reading. So it's going to be torn out of the hand of his son, Rehoboam. We've seen that. However, God says, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son. Probably emphasizing Judah heavily, and kind of counting Benjamin as under that, or maybe just God says one and ends up throwing in Benjamin because he can. Again, the point of the text is not to do the complex math and figure out which tribes count as what. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen. What's so significant about Jerusalem? That's where God's presence is dwelling, right? So notice the mercy of God. Even though Solomon has sinned to the extent that he deserves to have the kingdom completely ripped away from him, right? He's going after all these other gods. He's disobeyed everything that God told the kings of Israel to not do. Solomon has done. It's even more egregious when you consider all that God has done for him so far, and Solomon still throws all this away. Yet in God's mercy, and because of the promises that God has made, he says, I'm not going to give your sin everything it deserves. I'm going to wait and bring it after your lifetime, and I'm going to reserve part of the kingdom here, and it's going to include Jerusalem, and I'm going to continue to live there in your midst. That's a pretty big deal, right? So who is originally responsible for the breaking of the kingdom? We could say the sin of Solomon, right? Is he the only one responsible? No. Rehoboam's foolish decisions clearly result in this split as well. So it's the sin of Solomon from the past, it's Rehoboam's sin in the present, and as if to make things even more complicated, God is at work behind the scenes and is still mysteriously in control of the whole thing. So it's a very important, seminal, complex moment in Israel's history, and there's a lot going on, but that basically takes us through the divide of the kingdom. Tomorrow we will start looking at the north, at Jeroboam and his reign, and what trajectory he sets. So, thank you for watching.